Life has a way of shifting in an instant, pulling the ground out from under you when you least expect it. One moment, you're 32, blissfully married, making plans for the future with the person you love most in the world. The next, you're a widow, drowning in grief, forced to make agonizing decisions about cremation arrangements because your husband's body was too damaged for an open casket. That's exactly what happened to me. My name is Hannah, and 6 months ago my world shattered when my husband, James, died in a devastating car accident. The days that followed blurred together. A haze of funeral arrangements, endless condolence calls, and sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, unable to process the unbearable loss. If not for my parents stepping in to shoulder most of the funeral details, I don't know how I would have managed. "Hannah, honey, we've arranged everything with the funeral home," my mother told me, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it before. "You just focus on yourself right now." I barely registered her words at the time, but in hindsight I realize how much I leaned on them in those first few weeks. Still, even with their help, I felt lost, as if I had been abandoned in a new, terrifying reality I had no idea how to navigate. The grief support group became my lifeline. Every Tuesday evening I sat in a circle with others who truly understood the hollow ache in my chest, people who had also lost the love of their lives. Some days are harder than others. I confessed during one session, my voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I wake up and for a split second, I forget he's gone. Maria, a woman who had lost her husband 2 years ago, reached over and squeezed my hand. "That's normal, sweetie," she said gently. "Grief comes in waves." She was right. Some days the pain was a dull ache in the background. Other days it hit me like a tidal wave, pulling me under, making it hard to breathe. But slowly, I started to piece my life back together, tackling the practical matters James had left behind. Financially, I was secure. He had made sure of that. Our home in the suburbs, the downtown apartment, the sizable bank account. All of it was mine. I could have easily quit my job at the marketing firm and never worked another day in my life, but the thought of sitting alone in our empty house, drowning in silence, was unbearable. Instead, I cut back to part-time, just enough to keep my mind occupied without overwhelming myself. The most unexpected shift, however, came in my relationship with my parents. Growing up, I had always felt like an afterthought, constantly living in the shadow of my younger sister, Sarah. They never missed a single one of her dance recitals or school plays, but my academic achievements barely warranted a passing congratulations. Yet, after James's death, something changed. When they asked me if I could help them financially, sending them $1,500 a month, I agreed without hesitation. The weekly dinners at their house became a surprising source of comfort. Mom would cook her famous pot roast, Dad would pour the wine, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had their full attention. "Hannah, tell us more about that new project you're working on," my father would say, his interest in my career suddenly genuine. "The marketing campaign is going well," I'd respond, savoring the rare moment of connection. "My boss thinks it might bring in several new clients." For once, they actually seemed proud of me. But everything shifted the night Sarah joined us for dinner. She walked in, 7 months pregnant, effortlessly commanding the room the way she always had. I hadn't seen her since James's funeral, and yet, the moment she arrived, it was like the universe itself rearranged to accommodate her. "Sarah, sweetie, sit here," Mom fussed, practically pushing me aside to make space for her favorite daughter. "Do you need another pillow? Are your feet swollen?" And just like that, I became invisible again. I could almost hear the metaphorical door slamming shut, the one I had barely begun to step through. It was like watching an old wound reopen, a reminder that no matter how much things seemed to change, some things never really did. Determined to be a part of the conversation, I cleared my throat. "So, who's the father?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Have you told him about the baby?" Sarah's face darkened instantly. She stabbed at her peas with her fork, not meeting my eyes. "That's my business," she snapped. "I don't need to share every detail of my personal life." Before I could respond, Mom jumped to her defense. "Hannah, don't pry. Your sister doesn't have to explain herself to anyone." The words stung more than they should have. I couldn't help but notice how different their reaction was compared to when I was struggling with fertility treatments. Back then, they had no problem demanding updates, offering unsolicited advice, and making sure I knew exactly how they felt about every step of the process. But now? Now it was suddenly off limits. The double standard was glaring, suffocating, and painfully familiar. As I sat there, watching my parents dote on Sarah, their excitement over her pregnancy eclipsing everything else in the room, I realized something. I had been foolish to believe that losing James had somehow rewritten my place in this family. It hadn't. And maybe, just maybe, it never would. Unsolicited advice about my personal life had become a common theme, but I couldn't stop myself from pressing further. "But how are you planning to manage on your own?" I asked during another dinner, watching Sarah heap a second serving onto her plate. "Babies are expensive." She waved a hand dismissively, that all too familiar smirk playing on her lips. "Don't worry about my baby. We won't need anything from anyone. I've got it all figured out." I should have paid more attention to that mysterious smile, but I'd seen it too many times before. Sarah was always chasing one get-rich-quick scheme after another, none of which ever panned out. The organic smoothie business that lasted all of 2 weeks. The life coaching certification she never finished. The cryptocurrency investment that lost her 3 months' rent. "Trust me," she said, patting her belly with an air of confidence that should have set off alarm bells. "This time, everything is going to work out exactly as planned." Dad beamed at her like she had just announced a cure for cancer. That's my girl, always landing on her feet. I took another bite of pot roast, forcing myself to swallow down the all-too-familiar feeling of being second best. Some things never change, I thought. Watching my parents hang on Sarah's every word, their admiration for her as effortless as it had always been. The call from Sarah came on a Tuesday morning. I was at my desk reviewing marketing reports when my phone lit up with her name. I almost let it go to voicemail. Our conversations were usually brief and awkward, but something made me answer. "Hannah," she cooed, her voice dripping with the sugary sweetness she only used when she wanted something. "I'm having my baby shower next weekend at Mom and Dad's. I'd really love it if you could come." The invitation caught me off guard. The last real conversation we'd had was at James's funeral, and even then she had seemed distracted and uncomfortable. "Are you sure?" I asked, unable to hide my surprise. I could count on one hand the number of times Sarah had voluntarily included me in anything. "Of course," she laughed, the sound oddly forced. "You're my only sister. It wouldn't be right without you. Plus, I have something special planned." Something in her tone made my stomach clench, but I pushed the feeling aside. "I'll be there," I promised, already mentally listing possible gift ideas. Maybe this was her way of trying to bridge the gap between us. The following Saturday, I arrived at my parents' house carrying 2 carefully wrapped packages, a high-end baby monitor and a handmade blanket. Despite our differences, this was my future niece or nephew, and I wanted to do something thoughtful. The place looked like a pastel explosion had hit it. Pink and blue balloons covered every inch of the ceiling, streamers draped from the chandeliers, and in the center of the room sat an enormous diaper cake, stacked like an elaborate wedding centerpiece. Trust Sarah to turn a baby shower into a full-scale event. She had invited what looked like half the town. Aunt Margaret was there with her daughters, Mom's bridge club friends occupied the sofa, and Sarah's old college roommates clustered around the punch bowl, giggling over some long-forgotten inside joke. "Time for games," Sarah announced, wading through the crowd in a flowing maternity dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She was glowing, but there was something predatory in her smile that made me uneasy. Her eyes kept finding mine across the room, holding my gaze a beat too long. We played all the traditional baby shower games, measuring Sarah's belly with string, guessing the baby's birth date, and that horrible melted chocolate bar in a diaper game. I won the belly measuring contest, which seemed to irritate Sarah more than it should have. Throughout it all, she kept shooting me these strange looks, like she was waiting for something, like she had a secret she couldn't wait to reveal. After the gifts were opened, each onesie, baby gadget, and nursery decoration gushed over with theatrical enthusiasm. Sarah reached for my present. She held up the blanket, running her fingers over the intricate pattern, her expression unreadable. Then she clinked her glass for attention. The room fell silent. My heart started racing, for no reason at all. The air felt suddenly thick, suffocating. My lungs struggled to draw in breath. "I want to thank everyone for coming today," Sarah began, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Her voice was calm, almost sweet, but something in her tone sent a chill down my spine. But there's something else I need to share. I think it's time everyone knew who the father of my baby is. My heart started pounding. Sarah's eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew. I knew before she even said it. But knowing didn't soften the blow. The father, she announced, her voice ringing through the now eerily silent room, is James Wilson, Hannah's late husband. The world tilted sideways. A roaring filled my ears, drowning out everything except the sharp gasps and frantic whispers from the guests. Aunt Margaret clutched her chest in shock. Sarah's college friends huddled together, whispering in hushed, scandalized tones. But what hit me the hardest, the thing that made my stomach drop, was the look on my parents' faces. Not shock, not disbelief. They had known, all along. Before I could even begin to process the betrayal, Sarah was already speaking again, her voice thick with satisfaction as she turned to face me directly. As James's baby is his only heir, I'm entitled to half of everything he left you, Hannah, she declared, her tone filled with false righteousness. The house, the apartment, the money. My child deserves their father's inheritance. The room spun around me. My legs wobbled and I gripped the back of a chair just to stay upright. But before I could respond, before I could even begin to form words, my parents stepped forward, flanking Sarah like personal bodyguards. Hannah, Dad said, his voice shifting into his firm, businesslike tone, the one he used when making final decisions. You need to do the right thing here. Your nephew deserves his father's legacy. I'd finally found my voice, though it came out in a broken rasp. You're lying. All of you are lying. James would never... Oh no? Sarah's smile turned razor sharp as she pulled out her phone. Then how do you explain these? She held up the screen and my world collapsed all over again. There they were, James and Sarah, in each other's arms, kissing in what was clearly a hotel room. Another photo showed them holding hands across a candlelit table in a restaurant I didn't recognize. He loved me, Sarah declared, her voice carrying through the hushed room. He was planning to leave you for me. We were going to tell everyone, but then... She choked on her words, looking up, her eyes glistening with perfectly timed tears. Then the accident happened. And all our plans... I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My body moved on autopilot, grabbing my purse, pushing past the whispering guests, stumbling blindly toward the door. I heard my mother calling my name, but I was already in my car, already backing out of the driveway. The drive home was a blur. My mind kept replaying the photos, trying to make sense of them. The restaurant photo, it must have been taken during one of those business dinners he had claimed to attend. The hotel, probably from one of his frequent work trips. As soon as I walked through my front door, my phone started buzzing. Sarah was sending messages, dozens of them, screenshots of conversations between her and James. I don't love her anymore. I haven't for a long time. We'll tell everyone after the divorce. You're the only one I want to be with. I can't wait to start our life together. Message after message appeared on my screen, each one another stab to the heart. The timestamps stretched back months. While I had been undergoing fertility treatments, blaming myself for our struggles to have a child, my husband and my sister had been planning their future behind my back. I spent the night pacing the house, touching James's things, wondering if everything, our love, our life, had been a lie. The first call from my parents came at 7 a.m. sharp. I let it ring 4 times before answering. Hannah, you need to be reasonable about this, Dad started, skipping past any pleasantries. The sooner you agree to split the inheritance, the easier this will be for everyone. The casual arrogance in his voice made my blood boil. Easier for whom? I asked coldly. For Sarah, for you, for all of us, Mom chimed in, her voice coated in that artificial warmth she used when she wanted compliance. You don't want this to get messy, dear. The word came out as barely more than a whisper, but it sliced through me like a blade. When? A pause. A hesitation that told me everything before a single word was spoken. We've known for a while, Mom finally admitted, her voice hesitant. James confided in us about 6 months before the accident. The timeline hit me like a physical blow. 6 months. They had known for 6 months. And still, they had let me cry on their shoulders at his funeral. Still, they had accepted my money every month, pretending to care while knowing the truth. Traitors. The word felt cold and final on my tongue. All of you. I hung up and blocked their numbers. My hands trembled as I opened my banking app, but I didn't hesitate. With a few quick taps, I canceled the monthly transfer to my parents' account. Let them ask their precious Sarah for money. 2 weeks passed in a fog of missed calls and ignored text messages. Then came Sarah's email. She was threatening to sue me if I didn't voluntarily give up half of everything. The word voluntarily had never looked so much like a curse. I couldn't bring myself to reply. Couldn't even think about James's betrayal or how many people must have known, must have seen them together, while I remained oblivious. The whispers at work became unbearable. Some colleagues offered pitying looks, others barely concealed their smirks. Tom, my boss and one of the few true friends I had left, finally pulled me aside after I broke down in the middle of a client meeting. "Take some time off," he said gently. "Paid or unpaid, whatever works for you. Your job will be here when you're ready to come back." I nodded, grateful, and packed up my desk that same day. The next few weeks blurred together. I became a hermit in my own home. I had groceries delivered, ignored the doorbell when it rang, and spent hours staring at old photos, desperately searching for the signs I must have missed. Every happy memory felt like a mockery. Every moment of my marriage tainted by the knowledge that James had been living a double life. With my own sister. The news came via Facebook. Sarah had given birth to a boy. The photo showed her beaming in a hospital bed, our parents hovering proudly over their new grandson. The baby was wrapped in the cream-colored blanket I had knitted for the shower. It felt like a deliberate jab. I closed the app before I could read the comments, but not before I saw the name she had given him. James Jr. A week later, the court summons arrived in a thick manila envelope. My hands trembled as I opened it, already knowing what I'd find inside. Sarah was suing me. She was claiming her son's right to his father's inheritance and demanding half of everything James had left me. The legal language was cold and precise, laying out her demands in stark black and white. She wanted the house, half the money, partial ownership of the downtown apartment. I spent 3 days researching lawyers before settling on Richard Martinez, a seasoned attorney known for handling complex inheritance cases. "Miss Wilson," he said, shuffling through the stack of papers on his desk, his expression carefully neutral. "I have to be honest with you. Your sister has compelling evidence of a long-term relationship with your late husband. Text messages, photos, witness statements, including from your own parents." He paused, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. In inheritance cases like this, proof of an intimate relationship combined with a biological child, well, the courts tend to be sympathetic. I was still processing this devastating news when my phone rang that evening. Ew, I know number. "Hello? Is this Hannah Mitchell?" A woman's voice. Unfamiliar, yet something about it struck a chord of recognition. There was something in the cadence, the tone, that made my heart skip a beat. "Yes, who is this?" "I'm Elizabeth Parker." A brief pause. "James's mother." The world tilted sideways. I gripped the kitchen counter for support. "That's impossible," I whispered. "James was an orphan. He told me his parents died when he was young. He grew up in foster care." "Another one of his lies, I'm afraid," she said. Her voice was bitter, but not unkind. "Would you be willing to meet with me? There are things you need to know, things that might help you." We arranged to meet at a small cafe downtown the next morning. Neutral ground. I arrived early, stomach in knots, and ordered a coffee I couldn't drink. My hands shook so badly that I nearly dropped the cup when she walked in. The resemblance was uncanny. James had her eyes, her smile, even the way she carried herself, the same fluid grace I had always admired in him. "I was at the funeral," she said after we settled into a corner booth far from curious ears. "Back row, black dress and veil." My breath caught. I remembered her now. the solitary figure who had slipped out before the service ended. I had been too lost in my grief to wonder who she was. But now the memory crystallized with perfect clarity. The elegant woman in black, standing apart from the other mourners, her face hidden behind a dark veil. "Why are you coming to me now? Why are you coming forward now?" I asked, trying to keep the suspicion out of my voice. After all the recent revelations about James, I found it hard to trust anything or anyone connected to him. Elizabeth reached into her handbag and pulled out a worn manila envelope, its edges frayed as if it had been carried around for years. "Because I've heard what your sister is claiming," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something that sounded like regret. "And because, despite everything, I can't let another woman suffer from my son's lies." Her fingers trembled slightly as she slid the envelope across the table toward me. With shaking hands, I opened it, my breath catching as I pulled out the documents inside. Medical records from Boston General Hospital, dated 10 years ago, about a year before James and I got married. My eyes scanned the page and I felt the blood drain from my face. Complete azoospermia, permanently sterile, no possibility of natural conception. The clinical terms jumped out at me, each one a fresh, brutal blow. "James had these tests done when he was 25, Elizabeth explained softly. "He was devastated by the results. It was one of the last things we talked about before our falling out." I couldn't speak. All those years of fertility treatments, the endless doctor's appointments, the hormone injections, the tears, the self-blame. It had all been a cruel charade. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Sarah sat in the front row, cradling baby James Jr. while our parents flanked her protectively. She had dressed the part of the grieving almost widow to perfection. Demure black dress, minimal makeup, a carefully practiced look of sorrow. When she took the stand, she played to the gallery masterfully. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she spoke of her great love for James. "All I want is what's fair for my son," she declared, her voice breaking at just the right moment. "He deserves his father's legacy." Mr. Martinez, my lawyer, remained patient, waiting until she finished her performance before he spoke. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, standing and approaching the bench, "I'd like to submit evidence that proves Miss Thompson's entire claim is fraudulent." He handed the hospital records to the judge, who reviewed them with an unreadable expression. Across the room, Sarah's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection. We challenge the authenticity of these documents. Chain of custody, verification." Sarah's composure cracked. "Those documents are fake," she shrieked, clutching the baby closer. "She forged them to steal my baby's inheritance." Mr. Martinez remained unfazed. "Given that these medical records indicate Mr. Wilson was sterile, we request a DNA test to establish paternity." Sarah's lips curled into a triumphant smile. "That's impossible," she scoffed. "James was an orphan, and his body was cremated. There's no one to test against." Mr. Martinez barely blinked. "Actually," he said, gesturing to the gallery, "I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Parker, James Wilson's biological mother." A stunned murmur rippled through the courtroom as Elizabeth stood. Even from where I sat, I saw Sarah's face go ghostly pale. "I'm willing to submit to a DNA test," Elizabeth announced clearly, her voice carrying across the silent room, "to determine whether this child is my grandson." The judge nodded. "DNA testing is ordered. We will reconvene when the results are available." Sarah swayed slightly in her seat, her hands tightening around the baby. Our mother rushed to support her, shooting me a venomous glare, but for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt hope. The courtroom was silent as the judge opened the envelope containing the DNA test results. Sarah sat rigidly in her chair, her face a mask of controlled panic. Baby James Jr. slept peacefully in her arms, blissfully unaware of the storm about to break. The judge read the report, then looked up, her expression impassive. "The results conclusively show," she announced, her voice firm and unwavering, "that there is no genetic relationship between the minor child and Mrs. Elizabeth Parker. Therefore, it can be determined that James Wilson was not the father of this child." A collective gasp filled the room. Sarah's face crumpled. She began to sob, mascara streaking down her cheeks as reality crashed down around her. "Miss Thompson," The judge's voice rang out over the whispers. But Sarah wasn't listening. She had lost. And she knew it. The judge's expression turned stern, her voice cold and unwavering. Would you care to explain why you perpetrated this fraud upon the court? Sarah clutched the baby tighter, her face pale, her voice barely above a whisper. I was seeing several men at the time, she admitted, her words tumbling out in a rush. When James died and was cremated, I thought no one would ever know. He had money and I needed... So you attempted to defraud your own sister, the judge interrupted, her disapproval palpable. You used your own parents as unwitting accomplices in this scheme. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but the weight of her deception had finally shattered her carefully constructed facade. I just wanted security for my baby, she whimpered, her voice shaking. But her performance had lost its power. Even our parents, who had once stood so firmly by her side, looked stunned, finally realizing the depth of her deception. The judge's ruling was swift and unequivocal. This court finds in favor of the defendant, Hannah Mitchell. All claims to Wilson's estate by Sarah Thompson are dismissed, with prejudice. She turned her sharp gaze back to Sarah. Miss Thompson, you are fortunate that Mrs. Wilson has not pressed criminal charges for attempted fraud. Outside the courthouse, my parents approached me. Mom was crying, her mascara smudged, while Dad looked older than I had ever seen him. His shoulders slumped, his face lined with something that looked almost like regret. Haha, sweetheart, Mom murmured, reaching for my hand, her voice thick with desperation. We had no idea Sarah was lying. We can make this right. We've been struggling since you stopped the monthly transfers. I held up my hand. Don't. Without another word, I pulled out my phone, blocked their numbers right in front of them, and walked away without looking back. Elizabeth was waiting by my car. She watched me carefully as I approached, her eyes filled with quiet concern. Are you okay? She asked softly. I surprised myself by laughing, a real, genuine laugh. You know what? I think I actually am. Or I will be. I took a deep breath, the weight on my chest finally lifting. I've been thinking, I continued. That apartment downtown, the one James left me? I never liked it much. Too many memories. But maybe you'd like it? Her eyes widened in shock. Hannah, no, I couldn't possibly. Please, I insisted, pressing the keys into her hand. You gave me back my life with those medical records. Let me give you something in return. When I handed her the keys a week later, she broke down in tears. I never thought I'd have a daughter, she whispered, pulling me into a hug. That was 3 months ago. My family still tries to reach me, through mutual friends, distant relatives, even anonymous emails. But I've cut those ties too. Sarah sent a letter, claiming she had changed, that she was sorry, that she needed help with the baby. I threw it away, unopened. Instead, I have weekly dinners with Elizabeth. We're getting to know each other, sharing stories about James, the good and the bad. She's helping me see that while he wasn't the man I thought he was, that doesn't erase all the happy moments we once shared. Yesterday, I finally packed away James's remaining things. Elizabeth helped me donate some to charity and store others in the attic. As we worked, she told me stories about James as a little boy, before the lies, before the betrayal. Somehow, that helped. I'm not ready to date yet, but I've started living again. I returned to work full-time, joined a hiking club, and even planned my first solo vacation. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I barely recognize the woman staring back at me. Life has a way of surprising you. I lost the family I was born into, but I gained a new one I never expected. It's not the life I planned, but maybe, just maybe, it's the life I was meant to have all along. Life has a way of surprising us in ways we never imagined. If there is one thing I have learned from everything I have endured, it's that pain does not last forever. Betrayal does not define you. And the people who walk away from you were never truly meant to stay. For so long, I placed my trust in those who never truly saw me. I craved validation from a family that only loved me when it was convenient. I believed in a marriage that, as it turned out, was built on deception. I gave my heart, my time, my love, to people who never deserved it. And yet, here I am. I survived. If I could speak to the woman I was months ago, the one who sat alone, drowning in grief, questioning her worth, I would tell her this: you are stronger than you think. The love you give is never wasted, even when it is not returned. And walking away from those who hurt you is not weakness. It is the greatest act of self-respect. I learned that family is not just the one you are born into. Sometimes, family is found in the most unexpected places, in the people who stand beside you when the rest of the world turns away. Elizabeth became the mother I never had, proving that love is not bound by blood. I also learned that letting go is not the same as forgetting. The memories of James, both the good and the bad, will always be a part of me, but they do not define my future. I define my future. To anyone who has ever felt invisible, who has ever been betrayed by the people they trusted most, who has ever questioned their worth because of someone else's cruelty, I want you to know this: you are enough. You are worthy. And you deserve to build a life that brings you peace, even if it means leaving people behind. I lost the family I was born into, but I gained something even greater: a new sense of self, a new family built on honesty and love, and a future that is entirely my own. It's not the life I planned, but maybe it's the life I was meant to have all along.